In the rugged foothills of Wyoming's Wind River Range, where the land demands as much from its people as the harsh seasons themselves, two souls, scarred by life's cruelties, found a language beyond words and wholeness beyond physical form. When Victoria Mercer stepped off the train at Riverstone Station, her face half hidden beneath a heavy veil and her throat bearing the scars of a tragedy that had silenced her voice forever, she carried nothing but a worn leather trunk and tattered hopes for a future no one else would offer her. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. They whispered she was damaged goods, unmarriageable, a burden. But fate had different plans. When Jackson Harmon, a rancher with an empty sleeve where his left arm should have been, offered her a weathered hand and a chance no one else would give, he couldn't see her scarred face behind her veil. But he recognized something in her that others had missed, an unbroken spirit that mirrored his own Wyoming territory, 1878. The westbound train screeched to a halt at Riverstone Station, belching black smoke against a sky so vast and blue it seemed to swallow the mountains whole. Victoria Mercer pressed her gloved hand against the window, heart hammering beneath her high-necked traveling dress. 5 days of endless rocking and clattering from Philadelphia had brought her to this moment, her last chance at a life worth living. At 27, Victoria had resigned herself to spinsterhood back east. The horrific fire that claimed her parents' modest millinery shop 3 years ago had taken more than her family and livelihood. The scars that twisted down the right side of her face and neck had turned familiar faces away in pity or revulsion, and the damage to her throat had stolen her voice, leaving her with only a small slate and chalk to communicate. With dwindling savings and no prospects, the newspaper advertisement had appeared like divine intervention. Seeking bride of good Christian character and domestic abilities, aged 20-35, must be willing to relocate to Wyoming territory, will provide a comfortable home on an established cattle ranch. Reply with description to Garrett Williams, Riverstone, Wyoming territory. Victoria had been honest in her reply, painfully, completely honest. She described her appearance truthfully, explained her inability to speak, detailed her skills at sewing, cooking, and keeping accounts. She included a daguerreotype that showed her unscarred profile, but mentioned clearly that the other side of her face bore significant burn scarring. After weeks with no response, a letter arrived containing train fare and a brief note. "Your honesty is appreciated. Good character is more valuable than perfect appearance. Arrive on September 15th. Now, as the conductor called, Riverstone Station. 20 minutes stop." Victoria gathered her modest belongings with trembling hands. She adjusted her veil, a practical accessory she'd grown accustomed to wearing in public, and made her way to the exit. The late summer sun beat down relentlessly as she descended the steps, momentarily blinded by the brightness after the dim railway car. The platform was little more than weathered planks raised above hard-packed earth, with a small clapboard building serving as ticket office and telegraph station. Victoria scanned the sparse crowd for someone who might be Garrett Williams, her heart sinking as she realized no one was approaching her. Miss Mercer. A tall man in a dust-covered suit approached, his expression businesslike. "Frank Dawson. I work for Mr. Williams." Victoria nodded, reaching for the small slate hanging from a cord around her neck. She quickly wrote, "Yes, I am Victoria Mercer. Is Mr. Williams unable to come?" Dawson's eyes flickered briefly to her veil before returning to the slate. "I'm afraid there's been a complication." He handed her an envelope. "Mr. Williams was thrown from his horse 3 days ago, broke his neck, died yesterday morning." The slate nearly slipped from Victoria's suddenly numb fingers. She steadied herself against her trunk, feeling the ground shift beneath her feet. All her careful planning, her last desperate chance, gone. "There's money for your return journey," Dawson continued, his tone not unkind but clearly uncomfortable. "The eastbound train comes through tomorrow morning." Victoria stared at the envelope, despair washing over her. There was nothing to return to in Philadelphia. She had sold what little she had left to make this journey. With shaking hands, she wrote, "Is there any work in town? I have nowhere to go." Dawson shifted uncomfortably. "Riverstone's a small place, Miss Mercer. Not much call for—" He hesitated, eyes again darting to her veil. "Well, for someone. With your limitations." Victoria straightened her spine, drawing dignity around herself like armor. She had faced pity before. She had faced rejection. She would face this too. "I see. Thank you for meeting me," she wrote, her chalk nearly breaking with the pressure of her controlled hand. As Dawson tipped his hat and hurried away, clearly relieved to be done with his unpleasant task, Victoria remained standing beside her trunk, the weight of her situation settling over her like a shroud. The other passengers had dispersed, leaving her alone as the train pulled away with a mournful whistle that seemed to echo her despair. "Excuse me, ma'am, but you look like you could use a cup of coffee." The deep voice startled Victoria from her thoughts. A man stood several paces away, tall and broad-shouldered, wearing simple work clothes, a worn leather vest, and dusty boots. His face was striking, strong-jawed with thoughtful eyes beneath a wide-brimmed hat, but what caught Victoria's attention was his empty left sleeve, neatly pinned up at the shoulder. "I apologize for intruding," he continued when she didn't respond. "Name's Jackson Harmon. I run the Double Creek Ranch about 8 miles outside of town." He gestured toward the station building with his right hand. "I couldn't help overhearing. Sounds like you've had your plans upended." Victoria hesitated, then reached for her slate. "Victoria Mercer," she wrote. "Yes, the man I was to marry has died." Jackson Harmon read her slate, his expression shifting to one of understanding rather than pity. "I'm sorry to hear that." He paused, seeming to consider something. "There's a decent cafe across the street. They make a fine apple pie. Perhaps we could talk over coffee before you decide your next move." Victoria studied him cautiously. Years of unwanted stares and whispers had taught her to be wary, but there was something in Jackson Harmon's direct gaze that didn't falter when it met her veiled face. She glanced around the nearly deserted platform, weighing her limited options. "Just coffee," she wrote finally. "Thank you." Jackson nodded, making no move to take her arm or touch her trunk. "Ellis," he called over his shoulder, and a young cowboy who had been loading supplies onto a wagon jogged over. "Miss Mercer's trunk needs looking after while we get some coffee." "Yes, boss," the boy said, touching his hat respectfully to Victoria. Jackson led the way across the dusty street to a small building with a faded sign reading Morgan's Cafe. A bell jingled as they entered the warm space filled with the aroma of coffee and baked goods. Jackson Harmon, a plump woman with silver-streaked hair, called from behind a counter. "Twice in 1 week, the world must be ending." "Afternoon, Betsy," Jackson replied with easy familiarity. "This is Miss Victoria Mercer. She's had a difficult journey and could use some of your coffee and pie." Betsy's keen eyes took in Victoria's veiled face and the slate around her neck. Without comment, "Of course, take your usual table by the window, Jack. I'll bring everything right over." Once seated, Victoria found herself facing the first moment of genuine kindness she'd encountered since leaving Philadelphia. Jackson sat across from her, his single arm resting comfortably on the table between them. Unlike most people, he didn't stare at her veil or affect not notice it. "I imagine you're wondering why a stranger is buying you coffee," he said straightforwardly. "Truth is, Riverstone's a small town. News travels fast, especially on the train platform. I heard enough to gather you're in a difficult position." Victoria appreciated his directness. "I have nowhere to return to," she wrote. "I sold everything to come here." Jackson nodded thoughtfully. "I might have a proposition for you, Miss Mercer. If you're willing to hear it, Victoria tensed, immediately wary. She'd received too many inappropriate propositions after her parents' death. Men who thought her circumstances and scars made her desperate enough for any attention. Sensing her discomfort, Jackson quickly added, "Nothing improper, I assure you. It's just that I find myself in need of a housekeeper at my ranch. Mrs. Hollister, who's been with me for years, is getting on and could use help. The position would include a private room, meals, and fair wages." Victoria studied him, suspicion warring with desperate hope. "Why would you offer this to a complete stranger?" she wrote. "Because good help is hard to find out here," Jackson replied simply. "And because anyone who travels across the country to marry a man she's never met must have considerable courage and determination, qualities we value in Wyoming." He paused. "Your limitations don't concern me, Miss Mercer. My own life has taught me to judge people by what they can do, not what they can't." As Betsy brought over coffee and generous slices of apple pie, Victoria considered his words. The proposition offered at least temporary shelter while she determined her next steps. Still, caution made her write, "What would people say about a single woman living at your ranch?" "Mrs. Hollister serves as chaperone," Jackson answered. "She's been like a mother to me since my parents died, and her reputation is beyond question. Besides," he added with a hint of dry humor, "folks around here are too busy staying alive to worry too much about gossip." Victoria took a sip of her coffee, buying time to think. The alternative was using her return ticket to Philadelphia, where nothing awaited her but destitution. At least this offered shelter, food, and honest work while she planned her future. "I would need to know more about the position," she finally wrote. "The specific duties, hours, living arrangements." A smile warmed Jackson's face, transforming his serious expression. "Of course, reasonable questions." He proceeded to outline the responsibilities, assisting Mrs. Hollister with cooking for the ranch hands, keeping the ranch's accounts, managing household supplies, and general domestic duties. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "The ranch house has a small bedroom on the ground floor that would be yours," he explained. "It's simple but comfortable. Sundays would be your day off, though getting to town requires transportation, which we'd provide when possible." As he spoke, Victoria found herself cautiously optimistic. The work sounded manageable, perhaps even satisfying, compared to the uncertain future she had faced as a mail-order bride to an unknown man. "I'll accept your offer, Mr. Harmon," she wrote decisively, "on a trial basis if that suits you." "It does," Jackson replied, offering his hand across the table. "Welcome to Double Creek Ranch, Miss Mercer." As Victoria placed her gloved hand in his weathered one, she couldn't know that this handshake, born of desperation and practical necessity, was the first step on a path neither of them could have imagined, a path that would teach them both that the deepest scars were the ones no one could see, and the most profound communications required no voice at all. The journey to Double Creek Ranch gave Victoria her first real glimpse of the Wyoming territory she'd committed herself to, a land as beautiful as it was unforgiving. Jackson's wagon rumbled across vast expanses of sagebrush flats that stretched toward distant mountains like frozen waves. Golden afternoon light transformed the landscape into something almost mythical, the kind of wild beauty that made the heart ache with its indifference to human struggles. "That's Thunder Basin," Jackson explained, pointing toward a sweeping valley to the west. "Best grazing land in the county when the spring grass comes in. To the north is Wildcat Ridge. You don't want to get caught up there in a storm." Victoria nodded, taking in the geography with keen eyes. She'd studied maps before coming west, but nothing had prepared her for the sheer scale of this country, how small it made her feel, yet somehow not insignificant. There was dignity in being part of something so vast. As the wagon crested a small rise, Jackson slowed the horses. There it is, Double Creek Ranch. Below them spread a cluster of well-maintained buildings, nestled in a protected valley where two creek lines met, forming a natural boundary. The main house was larger than Victoria had expected, a two-story structure built of sturdy logs with a stone chimney and wide porch wrapping around three sides. Several outbuildings, a barn, bunkhouse, and what appeared to be a blacksmith shop formed a loose semicircle around a central yard. Beyond them, fenced pastures stretched toward distant hills where cattle grazed in scattered groups. "It's impressive," Victoria wrote on her slate, holding it up for Jackson to see. "My father started with nothing but a one-room cabin and 20 head of cattle," Jackson replied, pride evident in his voice. "Built it up over 30 years before the war. I've added the north pastures and some improvements to the house since taking over." As they approached, Victoria noticed a woman emerge from the main house, shading her eyes against the setting sun. Short and sturdy, with iron-grey hair pulled back in a no-nonsense bun, she stood with her hands on her hips, watching their approach with obvious curiosity. "That's Mrs. Hollister," Jackson said. "Been with my family since I was 10. Heart of gold under that gruff exterior, though she'd deny it fiercely if anyone suggested it." Victoria smoothed her travel-wrinkled skirt nervously. First impressions mattered, and she knew her appearance often made them difficult. "Miss Mercer doesn't speak, Agnes," Jackson called, as he brought the wagon to a stop in the yard. "She communicates by writing on her slate." Mrs. Hollister's eyebrows rose slightly, but she showed no other reaction to this news. "Well, that's one way to avoid saying foolish things," she remarked practically. "More folks could benefit from thinking before they speak." The unexpected response, so different from the awkward pity Victoria usually encountered, startled a silent laugh from her. She immediately covered her mouth with her gloved hand, but not before Jackson caught the rare moment of genuine amusement. "Miss Mercer had arranged to marry Garrett Williams," Jackson explained as he helped Victoria down from the wagon. "Unfortunately, she arrived to find he'd died from a riding accident. The fool who tried breaking that wild stallion." Mrs. Hollister shook her head. "Heard about that yesterday. Man had more pride than sense." She turned her direct gaze to Victoria. "So you'll be helping me keep this place from falling into chaos?" Victoria nodded, quickly writing on her slate, "I'm grateful for the opportunity, Mrs. Hollister." The older woman studied the message. Then Victoria herself, her gaze frank but not unkind. "Well, you've got a proper hand. That's more than can be said for half the so-called educated folk around here. Come inside. You must be exhausted, and supper needs tending." With that abrupt welcome, Mrs. Hollister turned and marched back toward the house, clearly expecting them to follow. Jackson gave Victoria a quick, reassuring smile. "Told you. Heart of gold." The interior of the ranch house surprised Victoria with its comfort and refinement. The large main room featured polished wooden floors, partially covered with colorful woven rugs. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, while bookshelves lined another. More books than Victoria had expected to find in a frontier home. The furniture was solid and well-crafted, arranged for conversation rather than display. "Kitchen's through here," Mrs. Hollister called, leading them through a doorway. "Dining room's to the right, though we only use it for Sunday dinners. Ranch hands eat at the kitchen table, except for special occasions." The kitchen was clearly the heart of the house, warm, organized, and surprisingly modern. A large iron cook stove gleamed with care, copper pots hung from a ceiling rack, and a pump at the sink indicated indoor water, a luxury Victoria hadn't dared hope for. Mrs. Hollister gestured toward a door off the kitchen. "That'll be your room. It's small but private." She opened it to reveal a neat chamber with a narrow bed, simple dresser, washstand, and small window overlooking a kitchen garden. "Mine's across the hall. Jackson's upstairs." "It's perfect," Victoria wrote, meaning it sincerely. After sharing crowded boarding house rooms in Philadelphia, this private space seemed like unimaginable luxury. "Good. Now wash up and help me get supper on the table. The men will be in soon, hungry as wolves." Mrs. Hollister handed her a clean apron. "You can unpack later." The next hours passed in a whirlwind of activity as Victoria found her place in the kitchen routine. To her relief, Mrs. Hollister was a clear, direct instructor who demonstrated what needed doing rather than relying solely on verbal explanations. Victoria's cooking skills were sound if limited, but her willingness to learn and quick hands earned grudging approval from the older woman. As sunset painted the kitchen windows, amber, the sound of men's voices and boot steps, announced the arrival of the ranch hands. Victoria tensed instinctively, reaching to ensure her veil was properly arranged. Mrs. Hollister noticed the gesture. "Leave it if it makes you comfortable," she said matter-of-factly, "but no one here will think less of you either way. These men work with cattle and horses all day. They've seen worse injuries than burns." Before Victoria could respond, the kitchen door swung open and 5 tired, dusty men filed in, led by the young cowboy, Ellis, who had watched her trunk at the station. They paused momentarily upon seeing her, then followed Jackson's lead, removing hats and nodding respectfully. "Miss Mercer will be helping Mrs. Hollister from now on," Jackson explained simply. "She doesn't speak, but communicates by writing. I expect you all to treat her with the same respect you show me and Mrs. Hollister." The men murmured agreement, their curiosity evident but contained. Ellis, who couldn't be more than 18, offered a shy smile. "Your trunk's in your room, Miss Mercer. Mr. Harmon had me bring it over while you ladies were cooking." Victoria nodded her thanks, relieved by the straightforward acknowledgement. As they settled around the large kitchen table, she helped Mrs. Hollister serve a hearty meal of beef stew, cornbread, and stewed apples. To her surprise, once the initial awkwardness passed, the atmosphere grew comfortable. The men discussed the day's work, upcoming tasks, and local news without treating her as an oddity or speaking around her. Jackson sat at the head of the table, contributing to the conversation with the natural authority of a man accustomed to leadership. Victoria observed how the ranch hands respected him without fear, how he managed to direct the conversation so each man had a chance to speak, and how his missing arm seemed forgotten in the competent way he managed everything one-handed. "Miss Mercer was set to be a mail-order bride," Ellis blurted out during a lull in conversation, then immediately flushed red to his ears when the foreman, a weathered man named Sam Taylor, cuffed him lightly. "Mind your manners, boy," Taylor growled. "That's not our business." Victoria surprised herself by reaching for her slate. "It's all right," she wrote. "Yes, I came to marry Mr. Williams. His loss is our gain," Mrs. Hollister declared firmly. "This kitchen's been needing another pair of capable hands." The simple acceptance in her tone eased something tight in Victoria's chest. For the first time since stepping off the train, she felt the faint stirrings of hope that she might find a place here. After the meal, when the men had returned to the bunkhouse and Mrs. Hollister had shown Victoria where everything belonged, in the kitchen, Jackson asked her to join him in the study. The small room off the main living area contained a desk, more bookshelves, and a comfortable chair near the window. "I thought we should discuss your duties more specifically," he explained, taking a seat behind the desk, "and establish a fair wage." Victoria sat across from him, slate ready. She'd expected to be shown to her room to collapse in exhaustion after the day's emotional tumult, but she appreciated Jackson's businesslike approach. "Mrs. Hollister oversees the household," Jackson began. "You'll assist her with cooking, cleaning, and preserving. But I understood from our conversation that you also have experience with bookkeeping." Victoria nodded, writing quickly. "I managed accounts for my parents' millinery shop." "Excellent. I've been handling the ranch books myself, but it's becoming More time-consuming as we expand. He gestured to the ledgers, stacked neatly on one side of the desk. I'd like you to take over record-keeping, correspondence, and supply ordering, if you're willing. The request surprised her. Most men she'd encountered assumed her muteness indicated limited intelligence. I would be happy to help, she wrote. I'm good with figures. I suspected as much, Jackson said with a smile. Education seems to run deeper in you than most who come west. He named a monthly wage that was more than fair, adding, plus room and board, of course. Sundays off, though, as I mentioned, getting to town requires transportation, which we can arrange when needed. Victoria accepted with a nod, writing, When would you like me to begin with the accounts? No rush. Take a few days to settle in and learn Mrs. Hollister's ways. We can start with the books next week. Jackson paused, studying her with those direct eyes that seemed to see beyond her veil. I know this isn't what you came west for, Miss Mercer, but I hope you might find some satisfaction here, at least until you determine your next steps. His acknowledgement that this arrangement might be temporary touched Victoria unexpectedly. He wasn't assuming she'd stay forever, grateful for any opportunity. He was offering genuine respect for her autonomy. Thank you, Mr. Harmon, she wrote. For everything, Jackson, he corrected gently. We're not overly formal at Double Creek. Victoria hesitated, then wrote, Victoria, then. Well, Victoria, he said, rising from his chair, I believe Mrs. Hollister would say we've both had enough excitement for one day. Get some rest. Tomorrow will come early enough. Alone in her new room that night, Victoria unpacked her meager belongings, 2 serviceable dresses besides the one she'd travelled in, undergarments, a nightgown, hairbrush, and a small wooden box containing her few treasures. Her mother's cameo brooch, her father's pocket watch, and a daguerreotype of her family taken before the fire. She removed her veil and looked at herself in the small mirror above the washstand. The right side of her face remained as it had always been. Hazel eyes, straight nose, firm mouth. The left side told the story of that terrible night. Pink and white scar tissue pulled her eyes slightly downward, twisted her full lips, and tracked down her neck to disappear beneath her high collar. The damage continued across her shoulder and chest, but the worst scars were the invisible ones on her vocal cords, forever silenced by the smoke and heat. For a moment, she allowed herself to acknowledge the grief of all she had lost, not just family and voice, but the normal life she'd once taken for granted. Then, with the practiced discipline of 3 years' survival, she pushed the sorrow aside. Self-pity was a luxury she couldn't afford. Victoria washed her face, changed into her nightgown, and slipped beneath the clean, simple quilt on her bed. Despite physical and emotional exhaustion, sleep eluded her as her mind processed the day's extraordinary turn of events, the cruel twist of arriving to find her intended husband dead, the unexpected kindness of a one-armed rancher, the matter-of-fact acceptance of a no-nonsense housekeeper. None of it matched the scenarios she'd imagined during those long days on the train, neither her cautious hopes nor her worst fears. She'd stepped off that train prepared to be a mail-order bride, only to find herself a housekeeper instead. Yet something about Double Creek Ranch felt not like home exactly, but like a place where she might eventually belong. Dawn arrived with the crowing of roosters and the distant sounds of men. Heading to the barn for morning chores, Victoria dressed quickly, arranging her hair in a simple knot and securing her veil before making her way to the kitchen. To her surprise, Mrs. Hollister was already showing signs of having been up for hours, kneading bread dough with strong, efficient movements. Good, you're up, the older woman said. Coffee's hot. Pour yourself a cup, then start on the bacon and eggs. Men need a proper breakfast before riding out. Victoria complied, grateful for clear direction. As they worked side by side preparing the substantial morning meal, Mrs. Hollister offered practical information about the ranch's routines. 6 men total, including Jackson and Ellis, who's more boy than man, but learning quick. Sam Taylor's foreman, been with the Harmons since before Jackson was born. Others are Pete Miller, brothers Jim and Thomas Reed. All decent men, though Jim drinks too much in town on Saturday nights. She handed Victoria a bowl of eggs to crack. Jackson's usually out by sunrise, checking the north pasture, back for breakfast, then working wherever he's needed most. Victoria nodded, taking mental notes of names and routines. She'd learned long ago to observe carefully, to compensate for her inability to ask quick questions. Supplies come from Riverstone once a month, Mrs. Hollister continued. Dry goods, flour, coffee, sugar. We grow most vegetables in the kitchen garden out back. Slaughter our own meat, of course. Preserve everything we can for winter. She glanced at Victoria. Winter comes harsh here, short growing season. You need to be prepared. Victoria wrote on her slate, "I'm a quick learner." Mrs. Hollister read it and nodded approvingly. Good. Too many come west thinking it'll be easy. Nothing's easy here, but it's honest work. When the men filed in for breakfast, Victoria was better, prepared for the interaction. She served plates alongside Mrs. Hollister, paying attention to who took their eggs, which way, who preferred more bacon, who wanted coffee strong or weak. These small details would help her establish her place in the household routine. Jackson arrived last, his hair damp from washing up. "Morning," he greeted them all, taking his seat at the head of the table. His eyes met Victoria's briefly. "Sleep well?" She nodded, offering a small smile behind her veil. The simple question, his awareness that her first night in a strange place might have been difficult, touched her. After breakfast, when the men had headed out for the day's work, Mrs. Hollister outlined Victoria's daily tasks, helping prepare 3 meals for hungry men. Cleaning the main rooms of the house, washing laundry on Mondays, baking on Tuesdays, and so on through a weekly schedule that had clearly served the ranch well for years. "Jackson says you'll be taking over the books and correspondence," Mrs. Hollister remarked as they washed dishes. "Good. The boy tries to manage everything himself, too stubborn to admit one arm makes some things harder. Not that he'd ever complain." Victoria raised an eyebrow in question. "Lost it at Antietam," Mrs. Hollister said, understanding the unasked question. "He was 19, came home changed, of course. Who wouldn't, but he didn't let it stop him." Her voice held fierce pride. "His father had just died. Ranch was struggling. Jackson taught himself to do everything one-handed rather than sell up, hired good men, made this place more successful than it ever was." Victoria absorbed this information, her respect for Jackson Harmon deepening. She wrote on her slate, "How did he manage? Determination, stubbornness, and a good dose of that Harmon pride." Mrs. Hollister's expression softened slightly. "There were dark days, mind you. Times I worried he might not find his way through the grief and pain. But that boy has iron in his soul." She fixed Victoria with a penetrating look, rather like someone else I'm beginning to know. Before Victoria could respond to this unexpected compliment, Mrs. Hollister briskly changed the subject. "Now, let me show you the garden. Those tomatoes won't pick themselves." The days that followed established a rhythm that Victoria found surprisingly comforting. The physical work, cooking, cleaning, gardening, occupied her body while allowing her mind to adjust to her new circumstances. Mrs. Hollister proved to be an exacting but fair teacher, demonstrating tasks once and expecting Victoria to remember them thereafter. The ranch hands gradually grew accustomed to her presence and her method of communication. Young Ellis, in particular, seemed to appoint himself her unofficial helper, carrying heavy water buckets or firewood without being asked. Victoria suspected Mrs. Hollister had assigned him the task, but his genuine kindness was obvious nonetheless. On her fourth morning at Double Creek, Jackson invited her to the study after breakfast. "Time to show you the books," he said, clearing space at the desk. For the next hour, he explained the ranch's accounting system, straightforward but comprehensive, tracking expenses, income, cattle counts, grazing rotations, and employee wages. Victoria was impressed by the meticulous records, all kept in Jackson's clear, strong handwriting. "I've always believed good management is as important as hard work," he explained, showing her the previous year's profit calculations. "My father was an excellent cattleman, but kept records on scraps of paper. When he died, it took months to sort out the ranch's financial position." Victoria studied the ledgers with growing interest. The operation was more substantial than she'd initially realized. Nearly 2,000 head of cattle, contracts with buyers in Cheyenne and beyond, breeding stock being developed for specific traits, experimental grazing methods tracked across different pastures. "You've built something impressive," she wrote on her slate. Jackson's expression held quiet pride. "Not alone. Every man who works here has contributed to what we've become." He paused. "That's why I'd like you to interview each of them about their observations of the herds, pasture conditions, and equipment needs. The men see things I might miss, but they don't always think to report details." Victoria's surprise must have shown in her eyes, because Jackson added, "Your slate makes people think before they speak. I've noticed how carefully the men choose their words when answering you." A smile touched his eyes. "It's proving good for discipline. The trust implicit in this assignment, allowing her to interact independently with his employees on business matters, represented a level of respect Victoria hadn't experienced since before her injuries. She wrote, "I'll create a schedule for individual interviews." "Excellent." Jackson gathered some papers from the desk. "I'll be riding the south boundary today with Sam, checking fences before we move the fall calves to that pasture." He stopped at the door. "Oh, and Victoria, feel free to make any improvements to the bookkeeping system you think appropriate. Fresh eyes often see better ways." Alone in the study, Victoria ran her fingers over the ledgers, a sense of purpose filling her. For the first time in years, this wasn't what she'd expected when boarding that train in Philadelphia. It was, in many ways, more meaningful than the marriage she'd sought. Here was work that mattered, that used her mind, that respected her abilities rather than focusing on her limitations. Looking out the study window at the vastness of Double Creek Ranch spread before her, Victoria felt something unfamiliar settle in her chest. Not quite belonging, not yet, but perhaps it's beginning. 3 weeks at Double Creek. Ranch transformed Victoria in ways she hadn't anticipated. Her hands, once soft from indoor work, now bore calluses from garden tools and laundry scrubbing. Her pale Philadelphia complexion had gained color from Wyoming's relentless sun during hours tending the kitchen garden. Most significantly, her spirit, which had been slowly withering under the weight of rejection and isolation back east, was gradually unfurling in this place where her contributions mattered more than her appearance. October arrived with frosted mornings and golden afternoons. The ranch hummed with activity as cattle were moved to winter pastures, the last hay cut and stored, and preparations made for the cold months ahead. Victoria threw herself into these preparations alongside Mrs. Hollister, preserving the garden's final harvest, smoking meat, mending winter clothes, and taking inventory of supplies. The ranch's books now displayed Victoria's influence, reorganized with additional categories, cross-referenced for easier tracking, and supplemented with notes. From her interviews with the ranch hands, Jackson had examined her changes with genuine appreciation, implementing several of her suggestions for tracking breeding lines and grazing rotation more effectively. "You've improved our system considerably," he told her one evening as they reviewed the monthly accounts in the study. The lamp between them cast warm light across the desk where ledgers lay open. Sam says your cattle tracking method has already helped him identify which bulls produce the hardiest calves. Victoria ducked her head slightly at the praise, still unaccustomed to such direct appreciation of her abilities. She wrote on her slate, "I enjoy the work." It shows. Jackson leaned back in his chair, studying her with those thoughtful eyes that seemed to look beyond her veil. "You know, when I offered you this position, I thought it might be temporary, something to tide you over until you found what you really wanted." Victoria tilted her head questioningly. "You're building a place for yourself here," Jackson continued. "The men respect you. Mrs. Hollister practically sings your praises in her own gruff way." His mouth quirked in a half-smile. "I've never seen the kitchen garden so productive or the account book so orderly." Victoria considered his words, then wrote carefully, "I never expected to find such purpose here. Thank you for the opportunity." "You've earned it," Jackson replied simply. He hesitated, then asked, "Would you mind telling me about yourself? Before, I mean." The request surprised her. Few people showed interest in her past, as if her scars had erased the person she'd been before the fire. Victoria picked up her slate, considering where to begin. After a moment, she wrote, "I grew up in Philadelphia. My parents owned a millinery shop. My mother designed hats. My father handled the business side. I was their only child, educated alongside their apprentices. I learned bookkeeping by helping my father design by watching my mother." She paused, erasing the slate before continuing, 3 years ago, fire destroyed the shop while we slept in. The apartment above. Neighbors pulled me out, but my parents didn't survive. I was unconscious for weeks. When I woke, my voice was gone, my face changed forever." Jackson's expression remained steady as he read, showing neither pity nor discomfort, just attentive interest. "And after?" he asked quietly. Victoria's hand tightened momentarily on her chalk. This part was harder to share, but his genuine interest deserved honesty. Everything changed. Friends became awkward, then distant. Our customers looked away. I sold what remained of the business, but funds dwindled quickly. Positions were closed to me once employers saw my face or realized I couldn't speak. Eventually, only the poorest boarding houses would accept me. She hesitated, then added, "That's when I answered Mr. Williams' advertisement." Jackson nodded slowly, absorbing her story. "It takes courage to leave everything familiar behind, especially after such loss," he said finally. "To seek a new beginning across the country with a stranger." Victoria appreciated his understanding. So many mistook her decision as desperate rather than brave. She wrote, "Now it's your turn. Tell me about Jackson Harmon." His eyebrows rose slightly at her directness, but he smiled. "Fair enough." He settled more comfortably in his chair. "Born right here at Double Creek. My father built this ranch from nothing, came west in '45 with just a wagon and dreams. Met my mother in Cheyenne. I was their only child, like you." Victoria listened attentively as Jackson described a childhood spent learning ranching from his father and literature from his mother, a former schoolteacher who insisted her son receive proper education despite their frontier location. She filled. "This house with books," he said, gesturing toward the well-stocked shelves. "Made me study Latin, history, mathematics. Said a man needs both practical skills and education to truly understand the world." His expression softened with memory. "She died when I was 15, pneumonia. My father kept her books, but the house felt hollow without her voice reading poems in the evenings." Victoria nodded in understanding, the parallel loss creating an unexpected connection between them. "When the war came, I enlisted despite my father's objections. He needed me here, but I was young, full of patriotic fervor." Jackson's gaze turned, distant. 2 years later, I returned with one arm and nightmares that I still visit occasionally. Found my father struggling to keep the ranch going with most able-bodied men away fighting. He flexed his remaining hand absently. 6 months after I came home, he died. Heart simply gave out, left me a half-crippled veteran with a struggling ranch, debts, and no idea how to manage it all. Victoria wrote quickly, "Yet you did." Jackson's smile held no self-pity. "Mrs. Hollister deserves most of the credit. She refused to let me wallow in grief or self-doubt. Said I could learn to run the ranch one-armed, or she'd find someone who appreciated their remaining limbs more." He chuckled softly. Tough love, but effective. Their conversation continued as the lamp burned low, sharing details of their lives that built understanding between them. Victoria described her mother's artistic talent with ribbons and feathers. Jackson recalled his father teaching him to track animals through fresh snow. They discovered shared loves, reading, mathematics, sunrises, and differences that sparked interesting debate when Victoria boldly challenged his opinion on cattle breeding methods. When the clock on the mantel struck 10, both seemed surprised by how quickly time had passed. "We should rest," Jackson said reluctantly. "Early day tomorrow." Victoria nodded, rising from her chair. At the study door, she paused to write one last note. "Thank you for asking about my past. Most people prefer to pretend I didn't exist before the fire." Jackson read it, then met her, eyes directly through her veil. "I find who you were, then helps me understand who you are now. Both matter." The simple statement stayed with Victoria long after she'd retired to her room, resonating with unexpected power. Both matter. The idea that her past and present could coexist, neither erased nor defined exclusively by her scars, felt revolutionary. The following afternoon, Victoria was in the kitchen garden harvesting the last of the root vegetables when she heard approaching hoofbeats. Looking up, she saw Jackson returning early from checking the north pasture fence line with Sam. Something in the foreman's rigid posture and Jackson's tense shoulders sent a chill through her despite the warm autumn sun. Victoria set down her basket and hurried to meet them as they dismounted in the yard. Sam was supporting Jackson, who appeared to be favoring his right leg. "What happened?" she wrote quickly on her slate. "Stepped in a groundhog hole while checking the fence," Sam explained gruffly. "Heard the bones snap from 10 feet away." Jackson grimaced, his face pale beneath his tan. "It's not that bad." "Like hell it's not," Sam muttered. "Leg's broken clean through. Need to get Doc Miller out here." "Ellis already rode for him," Jackson said through gritted teeth. "Help me inside first." Victoria stepped forward, placing herself under Jackson's right arm, while Sam supported his left side. Together they maneuvered him into the house and onto the sofa in the main room. Mrs. Hollister appeared from the kitchen, took one look at Jackson's awkward leg position, and began issuing brisk orders. "Sam, fetch my scissors and the whiskey from the kitchen. Victoria, get clean linens from the hall cupboard. We need to cut that boot off before the swelling gets worse." The next hour passed in controlled chaos. Mrs. Hollister cut away Jackson's boot and pant leg to reveal an already swelling shin with an unnatural angle that made Victoria's stomach turn. Jackson endured their ministrations stoically, accepting 2 fingers of whiskey, but remaining clear-headed and composed despite what must have been excruciating pain. Dr. Miller arrived by mid-afternoon, his weathered face creasing with concern. As he examined the break, "Clean fracture of the tibia," he announced, after gentle probing that left Jackson white-lipped. "Needs to be set properly and immobilized for at least 6 weeks." Victoria hovered nearby as the doctor prepared to set the bone, offering Jackson a wooden spoon to bite down on. To everyone's surprise, Jackson reached for her hand instead, gripping it tightly as Dr. Miller manipulated the broken bone back into alignment with a sickening sound. Jackson's hand nearly crushed hers, but he made no sound beyond a sharp intake of breath. "Good man," Dr. Miller murmured, efficiently splinting and wrapping the leg. "Now, absolute rest for at least 2 weeks. No weight on it whatsoever. After that, crutches only, and limited movement for another month." Jackson's jaw tightened. That's impossible. We're preparing for winter, moving the last herds, building the new storage shed. And all that will have to continue without you. On horseback, Dr. Miller replied firmly, unless you want to risk permanent damage or infection. He glanced at Victoria and Mrs. Hollister. Make sure he follows orders. He's a terrible patient. After the doctor left with Sam to show him out, Mrs. Hollister went to prepare a pain tincture, leaving Victoria alone with Jackson. His face showed frustrated resignation as he looked down at his splintered leg. First my arm, now this, he said with a bitter laugh. Soon I'll have no useful limbs left. Victoria frowned behind her veil, then wrote firmly on her slate, Self-pity doesn't suit you. Jackson looked startled, then chagrined. You're right, forgive me. She erased and wrote again. Nothing to forgive. But the ranch won't fall apart without you on horseback for a few weeks. It might, he sighed. There's so much to coordinate before winter sets in. Victoria considered for a moment, then wrote decisively, You can direct operations from here. Sam knows the land. The men respect him. I can act as your eyes, reporting conditions, carrying instructions. Jackson studied her words, then her determined posture. You've never ridden the pastures, she wrote quickly. I can learn. Ellis can teach me. It's a rough country, Jackson warned. Victoria's response was immediate. So is life. We adapt. Something shifted in Jackson's expression. Respect mingled with something warmer. He reached for her hand again, holding it gently this time. Thank you, he said simply. The following weeks transformed Double Creek Ranch's operations. With Jackson confined to the house, Victoria became his liaison to the outside work. Each morning, she rode out with Sam or one of the other hands, learning the ranch boundaries, checking cattle, delivering Jackson's instructions, and returning with reports and questions. Her first attempts at horsemanship were awkward. Philadelphia had offered little opportunity for riding, but Ellis proved a patient teacher, and Victoria's determination compensated for her inexperience. By the end of the first week, she could manage a steady trot around the property. By the second, she was accompanying Sam on longer rides to the outlying pastures. Inside the house, they established new routines. Jackson initially resisted being moved downstairs to the small guest room off the main living area, but practical necessity overruled his pride. Each evening, Victoria would bring the account books to his room, sitting beside his bed as they reviewed the day's operations and planned the next day's tasks. These quiet evening sessions gradually evolved beyond ranch business. Jackson began asking Victoria to read to him from his mother's beloved books, poetry, history, philosophy, taking pleasure in hearing the words even if the voice speaking them wasn't her own. Victoria found unexpected joy in giving voice to these texts through her written words, occasionally adding her own observations that sparked spirited discussions. One evening, as Victoria was reading from Emerson's essays, Jackson interrupted with an unexpected question. Do you ever miss your voice, truly hearing yourself speak aloud? Victoria lowered the book, considered the question, then wrote thoughtfully, Every day, especially when I want to call out a warning or express something quickly. But the greatest loss is singing. I love to sing. Jackson nodded, his expression contemplative. I miss using two hands to play the violin. My mother taught me as a boy. He gestured toward a case on the high bookshelf that Victoria had never noticed before. Some losses stay with you. Victoria wrote, Yet we find new ways, different beauties. Such as? Jackson asked. She thought for a moment, then wrote, I notice visual details more intensely now. Since I can't exclaim about them, I observe more carefully. The particular blue of the morning sky here, so different from Philadelphia, the way light catches on dew-covered grass, the subtle differences in cattle markings that others miss. Jackson smiled. I've noticed that about you, how carefully you see the world. He shifted slightly, adjusting his splinted leg. For me, it's tough. After losing my arm, I discovered my remaining hand became more sensitive. I can feel differences in cattle hide that tell me about their health, sense weather changes in how the reins feel against my palm. This exchange, the honest acknowledgement of both loss and adaptation, created a new intimacy between them. Neither pitied the other, yet both understood the daily reality of navigating a world designed for wholeness they no longer possessed. As October gave way to November, bringing the first light snowfall and bitter winds, the ranch settled into winter rhythms. Cattle were now contained in sheltered pastures near the main buildings. Daily chores focused on feeding and maintenance rather than range riding, and evenings lengthened with the early darkness. Jackson graduated to crutches, his frustration at limited mobility tempered by steady improvement. Victoria continued managing the books and correspondence, but resumed more household duties as outdoor work decreased. Their evening sessions moved from Jackson's bedroom to the main living area, where a fire burned continuously against the growing cold. One such evening, with Mrs. Hollister already retired and snow falling softly outside, Jackson set aside the breeding charts they'd been reviewing to ask Victoria an unexpected question. "Why did you continue wearing your veil? Here, I mean." After the first days, Victoria stilled, surprised by the directness of his query. No one at Double Creek had mentioned her veil since her arrival. They'd simply accepted it as part of her, like her slate and chalk. She considered her answer carefully before writing, "Habit, partly. Protection, mostly. Not for me, but for others. People find my scars difficult to look at. It simplifies interactions." Jackson's expression remained thoughtful, free of judgment. "Do the scars pain you still?" She shook her head, writing, "Only in extreme cold or heat. Mostly they're just there, like my missing arm," Jackson observed, "present in its absence." Victoria nodded, appreciating his understanding. Then, feeling suddenly brave in the firelit room, she wrote, "Would you like to see my face without the veil?" Jackson's eyes widened slightly, recognizing the significance of her offer. "Only if you're comfortable," he said quietly. "But yes, I would." With slightly trembling fingers, Victoria untied the ribbons securing her veil and slowly lifted it away. She resisted the urge to turn her scarred side from his view or raise a hand to cover the worst damage. Instead, she faced him directly, allowing him to see her fully for the first time. Jackson studied her face without flinching or looking away. His gaze moved carefully over her features, the unmarred right side, with its clear hazel eye and smooth skin, the scarred left with its web of pink and white tissue pulling her eye and mouth slightly downward. Victoria held herself perfectly still, hardly breathing as she waited for the reaction she'd seen too many times, the quick glance away, the careful rearrangement of features to hide discomfort or disgust. Instead, Jackson simply said, "Thank you for showing me." The words were simple, but his tone held such genuine appreciation that Victoria felt unexpected tears prick her eyes. Not pity in his voice, respect for her trust, and perhaps something more. "Your scars tell a story of survival," Jackson continued softly. "They're part of you, but they don't define you any more than my empty sleeve defines me." He held her gaze steadily. "In fact, I find them rather beautiful in their own way." Victoria blinked rapidly, emotions threatening to overwhelm her. She reached for her slate with unsteady hands, writing just 2 words, "Thank you." Jackson nodded, understanding all she couldn't express. Neither spoke for several minutes, the crackling fire and ticking clock the only sounds in the room. Something had shifted between them, a barrier lowered, a trust deepened. Finally, Jackson broke the comfortable silence. "It's getting late. We both should rest." Victoria nodded, replacing her veil more from habit than necessity. As she gathered her slate and prepared to rise, Jackson reached for her hand. "Victoria," he said, her name soft on his lips. "I'm glad. Fate brought you to Double Creek, even through such a difficult path." She squeezed his hand in response, a gesture more eloquent than any words she might have written. As she made her way to her room that night, Victoria realized that despite the silence of her voice, she was, perhaps for the first time since the fire, truly being heard. December transformed Wyoming into a realm of white and gray, the familiar landscape of Double Creek Ranch, disappearing beneath deep snow and biting wind. The harsh winter months brought the ranch household closer together physically. Daily activities centered around the main house, bunkhouse and barn, with only necessary journeys to check on cattle in the sheltered pastures. Victoria had never experienced such isolation. In Philadelphia, even in her darkest days after the fire, streets remained navigable, stores open, other humans within calling distance. Here, snowstorms could cut them off completely for days. The nearest neighbor 5 miles away, town an impossible 8-mile journey during the worst weather. Yet strangely, she found herself less lonely than she'd been in the crowded eastern city. The ranch formed its own small, self-contained community. Evenings brought shared meals, card games, music from Jim Reed's harmonica, and stories exchanged around the fire. Without the constant presence of strangers to judge her appearance or communication methods, Victoria found herself relaxing, even occasionally leaving her veil off inside the house, though never when all the ranch hands were present. Jackson's leg was healing well. He'd graduated from crutches to a sturdy walking stick, his natural determination speeding his recovery despite Dr. Miller's warnings about doing too much too quickly. The forced inactivity had been difficult for him, but it had also provided unexpected opportunities, more time for reading, for teaching Victoria about cattle breeding theories, for planning spring improvements to the ranch. 4 days before Christmas, a break in the weather allowed Sam and Ellis to make the journey to Riverstone for mail and supplies. They returned late afternoon with saddlebags full of letters, parcels, and news from town. "Stagecoach finally got through from Cheyenne," Sam reported as they gathered in the kitchen, snow melting from his coat and hat. "Brought the mail that's been piling up for weeks." Mrs. Hollister sorted through the stack efficiently, passing out envelopes to their recipients. Jackson received several business correspondences and a thick letter from his mother's sister in Boston. Victoria was surprised when Mrs. Hollister handed her an envelope addressed in unfamiliar handwriting. "All the way from Philadelphia," Mrs. Hollister noted. "Someone found you." Victoria examined the envelope with trepidation. Few people from her past had maintained contact after the fire. Opening it carefully, she discovered a brief letter from Mrs. Bedford, wife of her father's former business partner, expressing belated condolences about Garrett Williams' death. News had apparently reached Philadelphia through mutual acquaintances. The letter continued with gossip about Philadelphia society and concluded with an unexpected proposal. Mrs. Bedford's brother owned a glove-making shop in Boston and needed someone with bookkeeping experience. If Victoria wished to return east, Mrs. Bedford would help arrange the position. "Good news?" Jackson asked, noticing her prolonged silence. Victoria hesitated, then handed him the letter. He read it quickly, his expression carefully neutral. "An opportunity," he said, returning it to her. "When would you need to decide?" She wrote on her slate, "She asks for a reply by spring, when travel would be easier." Jackson nodded, his eyes revealing nothing of his thoughts. A sensible time frame. Before Victoria could respond, Ellis burst into the kitchen, his young face flushed with excitement. "There's a man coming up the drive, single rider on a bay horse." Jackson frowned. "In this weather? Must be important." They moved to the windows, watching as the rider approached, a well-dressed man in an expensive coat, his horse-quality stock despite its exhausted appearance. As he drew closer, Victoria felt an inexplicable tension tighten her shoulders. "That's Lawrence Preston," Mrs. Hollister said, surprise evident in her voice. "Owns the big spread east of here, the Diamond P. What's he doing out in this weather?" Jackson's expression hardened almost imperceptibly. "Sam, see his horse. Victoria, would you ask Mrs. Hollister to prepare coffee? I'll meet him at the door." Victoria hurried to relay the message, curious about Jackson's subtle change in demeanor. By the time she returned to the main room, Preston had been welcomed inside and was warming himself by the fire, his expensive gloves and hat placed carefully on a side table. Lawrence Preston was perhaps 50, silver streaking his dark hair and beard, his bearing aristocratic despite the trail dust on his fine clothes. His sharp eyes took in every detail of the room, lingering briefly on Victoria as she entered. Something in his assessing gaze made her reach instinctively to ensure her veil was properly arranged. "Miss Mercer, may I present Lawrence Preston of the Diamond P Ranch," Jackson said formally. "Mr. Preston, Miss Victoria Mercer, who manages our household and accounts." Preston bowed slightly. "Miss Mercer, your reputation precedes you." Victoria tilted her head questioningly, reaching for her slate. "Small communities breed abundant gossip," Preston explained, with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Word travels about a mysterious veiled woman with excellent business acumen who's transformed Double Creek's operations." Victoria wrote quickly, "You exaggerate, sir. I merely assist Mr. Harmon." "Modesty as well as intelligence," Preston remarked, turning to Jackson. "Rare qualities these days, wouldn't you agree?" Jackson's smile was polite, but reserved. "Did you brave this weather just to meet my housekeeper, Lawrence, or is there another purpose to your visit?" Preston chuckled, settling into a chair as Mrs. Hollister arrived with coffee. "Direct as always, Harmon. Very well. I've come with a proposition, one that could benefit us both considerably." As Mrs. Hollister served coffee and then discreetly withdrew, Preston outlined his proposal. The railroad was considering extending a spur line that would pass near both their properties, making cattle shipping significantly easier and more profitable. However, they needed guaranteed volume to justify the investment. "If we combine our herds for shipping purposes, we'd provide precisely the numbers they require," Preston explained. "The railroad would build a loading station just 3 miles from your northern boundary." Jackson considered this thoughtfully. "It would certainly reduce our drive time to the Cheyenne yards." "Precisely," Preston nodded, his expression eager. "But there's more. I've been corresponding with buyers in Chicago who want premium beef, the kind your breeding program produces. Together, we could command top prices." Victoria listened carefully, noting both the potential advantages and Preston's careful flattery. Something about the man triggered her caution, though she couldn't identify precisely why. Jackson seemed similarly reserved. "It's an interesting proposition, Lawrence. I'd need to review the details carefully before considering any formal arrangement." "Of course," Preston agreed smoothly. "I've brought some preliminary figures." He withdrew papers from his coat, spreading them on the table. "Perhaps Miss Mercer would be kind enough to look them over as well? I understand she has quite the head for business." Jackson glanced at Victoria, who nodded her willingness. For the next hour, they reviewed Preston's proposal, Victoria occasionally writing questions that Jackson voiced. The basics appeared sound. Combining herds for shipping would indeed provide benefits to both ranches, but certain aspects of Preston's proposed profit distribution seemed subtly weighted in his favor. When Victoria discreetly slid her slate to Jackson with 60-40 split hidden in paragraph 3 written on it, Preston's eyes narrowed briefly before his smooth smile returned. "You have an exceptionally thorough assistant, Harmon," he commented. "One might almost think she distrusts me." Victoria flushed beneath her veil but held her ground, writing boldly, "Not distrust. Verification. Jackson suppressed a smile. Miss Mercer is quite right to verify all details. It's why I value her assistance. He gathered the papers. I'll need time to consider this properly, Lawrence. Perhaps after the new year. Preston appeared disappointed, but acquiesced gracefully. With weather worsening, Jackson invited him to stay overnight, an offer Preston accepted with apparent gratitude. Victoria arranged the guest room, while Mrs. Hollister prepared an elaborate dinner, the household extending its best hospitality despite the unexpected visitor. During dinner, joined by Sam as foreman, the conversation flowed easily enough, though. Victoria noticed how Preston dominated the discussion, speaking of his connections in Cheyenne and Denver, his prize-winning horses, his plans for expanding the Diamond P. Jackson listened more than he spoke, offering thoughtful comments when appropriate, but never attempting to match Preston's self-promotion. It was only when Preston asked about Jackson's wartime experience that a subtle tension entered the conversation. "The 6th Wisconsin, wasn't it?" Preston inquired, sipping his wine. "You must have seen significant action." "Some," Jackson replied simply. "I had business interests that kept me from enlisting," Preston continued, "but I followed the campaigns closely. Terrible business at Antietam, where you were wounded, as I recall." Jackson nodded, his expression controlled. "Many good men died there, indeed." Preston's gaze shifted to Jackson's empty sleeve. "A significant sacrifice. Makes running a ranch rather challenging, I would imagine." Before Jackson could respond, Victoria surprised everyone, including herself, by tapping her spoon sharply against her water glass. All eyes turned to her as she wrote firmly on her slate, "Mr. Harmon's ranch runs more efficiently than most, with fully staffed owners." A moment of startled silence followed before Sam let out a short bark of laughter. "The lady's right about that," he agreed, raising his glass in Victoria's direction. Jackson's expression remained composed, but gratitude flickered in his eyes, as he smoothly changed the subject to spring cattle prices, allowing Preston no opportunity to continue his thinly veiled condescension. Later that night, after everyone had retired, Victoria found herself unable to sleep, Preston's presence in the house creating an inexplicable unease. Wrapping a shawl around her nightdress, she slipped quietly to the kitchen for a cup of tea, surprised to find Jackson already there, staring into a cup of something stronger than tea. He looked up as she entered, offering a tired smile. "Couldn't sleep either." Victoria shook her head, reaching for her slate that always hung near the kitchen door. "Our guest makes the house feel strange." "Lawrence Preston has that effect," Jackson agreed dryly. "He fills every room he enters, doesn't he? All grand plans and important connections." Victoria hesitated, then wrote, "He was deliberately unkind about your arm." "Ah, that." Jackson shrugged, slightly. "Lawrence has always measured men by what he considers strength. He sees my missing arm as a weakness, a competitive advantage for him." She frowned, writing quickly, "There's nothing weak about you." The simple declaration brought warmth to Jackson's tired eyes. "Thank you for defending me at dinner. It wasn't necessary, but I appreciated it nonetheless." Victoria sat across from him, writing thoughtfully. "His business proposal seems designed to benefit him more than you. Noticed that too, did you?" Jackson smiled. "Yes, Lawrence's partnerships typically serve Lawrence best. Still, the railroad connection could be valuable if we negotiate better terms." She nodded agreement, then wrote a question that had been bothering her. "How did he know about me? My reputation, as he called it." Jackson's expression darkened slightly. "Lawrence makes it his business to know everything happening in the county. Information is power to men like him." He took another sip from his cup. "What concerns me is his interest in you specifically." Victoria tilted her head questioningly. "Lawrence Preston collects valuable things," Jackson explained carefully. Land, horses, connections. When he sees something, or someone, he considers valuable, he typically finds a way to acquire it. The implication sent an uncomfortable shiver through Victoria. She wrote, "I'm not a horse to be purchased." "No," Jackson agreed, his voice taking on a protective edge. "You're not. But Lawrence may have other ideas." The conversation lingered in Victoria's thoughts as she finally returned to her room. Preston's interest, combined with Mrs. Bedford's letter offering a position back east, suddenly made her position at Double Creek seem less certain than it had just days ago. External forces were intruding on the sanctuary she'd found here. Morning brought heavy snow and the welcome news that Preston had departed early, leaving a note thanking them for their hospitality and reiterating his interest in a partnership. The household settled back into its normal rhythms, preparing for Christmas with simple decorations gathered from the pine forest at the edge of the ranch property. 3 days later, as Victoria was helping Mrs. Hollister prepare Christmas Eve dinner, a package arrived addressed to her, delivered by one of Preston's ranch hands who'd braved the snow. Inside, she found an exquisite leather-bound journal with her initials embossed in gold, accompanied by a note from Preston expressing his admiration for her intelligence and offering her a position as account manager at the Diamond P at twice. "Whatever Harmon pays you." Victoria showed the gift and note to Jackson immediately, her indignation evident in her rapid writing. "How dare he try to steal your employee?" Jackson studied the expensive journal, his expression unreadable. "It's a generous offer. The Diamond P is larger than Double Creek. The position would come with more responsibility, higher status." Victoria stared at him in disbelief, scribbling quickly. "You can't think I would consider it? Shouldn't you?" Jackson asked quietly. "Along with Mrs. Bedford's offer from Boston? You came west seeking opportunity, Victoria. Perhaps these are the opportunities you were meant to find." Something in his tone made Victoria pause, studying his face more carefully. Behind the calm exterior, she detected uncertainty, even vulnerability that she'd rarely seen in him. With sudden clarity, she realized he was deliberately stepping back, offering her freedom to choose without the weight of any obligation to him. Slowly, deliberately, she wrote on her slate, "I'm not interested in Lawrence Preston's offer, nor in returning east." Relief flickered across Jackson's features before he schooled his expression. "You should take time to consider all options. Your future is important." Victoria shook her head firmly, writing, "I know what I want." The intensity in her eyes as she held his gaze made further discussion unnecessary. Jackson nodded, understanding passing between them without words. "What shall we do with this?" he asked, indicating Preston's gift. Victoria considered, then wrote with a small smile, "Keep the journal, it's quite nice. Return the note with my respectful declination." Jackson laughed, the tension broken. A practical solution worthy of Mrs. Hollister herself. Christmas Eve brought the entire ranch household together. Jackson, Victoria, Mrs. Hollister, and all 5 ranch hands gathered in the main room for a celebration, simple in its offerings but rich in warmth. Mrs. Hollister and Victoria had prepared a feast that left even the hungriest cowboys satisfied. Ellis played carols on a battered harmonica, and Sam surprised everyone with a remarkably good singing voice for traditional Christmas hymns. Modest gifts were exchanged, knitted scarves from Mrs. Hollister, hand-carved wooden figures from Thomas. Reed, peppermint sticks and oranges that Jackson had somehow procured despite the winter isolation. Victoria had secretly embroidered handkerchiefs for each of the men, including a special one for Jackson with the Double Creek brand stitched in one corner. When the celebration wound down and the hands returned to the bunkhouse through the gently falling snow, Jackson asked Victoria to remain in the main room while Mrs. Hollister retired for the night. "I have something for you," he said, retrieving a small package from his desk, "a proper Christmas gift." Victoria accepted it curiously. Unwrapping the simple brown paper revealed a beautifully crafted wooden case containing a new slate, not the ordinary school slate she currently used, but one framed in polished cherry wood with her initials inlaid in darker walnut. Accompanying it was a set of fine chalk sticks in white and several colors. "I noticed your current slate is wearing thin," Jackson explained as she ran her fingers over the smooth surface. "Sam helped with the woodwork, but the design is mine." Deeply touched, Victoria immediately used the new slate to write, "It's beautiful. Thank you." Then, after a moment's hesitation, she added, "I have something else for you too." Jackson watched, curiously as she slipped from the room, returning moments later with a carefully wrapped package. Inside, he found a leather-bound book, but unlike Preston's showy gift, this one was clearly handmade, its pages filled with Victoria's neat handwriting. "What's this?" he asked, turning the pages carefully. Victoria wrote on her new slate, "Your mother's recipes. Mrs. Hollister has been reciting them to me for weeks. I've recorded them all, along with her notes about your favorites as a child." Jackson stared at the book, then at Victoria, genuine emotion washing across his features. "This is—" he began, then stopped, collecting himself. "No one has done anything like this for me since she died. How did you know?" Victoria wrote, "You mentioned missing her voice reading poetry. I thought perhaps her recipes were another way her voice remained with you." The simple insight into something Jackson had never explicitly stated revealed how deeply Victoria had come to understand him. For a long moment he said nothing, just holding the book as if it contained something far more precious than recipes. When he finally looked up, the firelight reflected the moisture in his eyes. "Thank you, Victoria. This means more than I can express." In the quiet Christmas Eve stillness, with snow falling gently outside and firelight casting golden shadows across the room, something shifted between them, moving beyond friendship, beyond mutual respect, into territory neither had dared acknowledge before. Yet even as Victoria's heart responded to the warmth in Jackson's eyes, a shadow of doubt flickered at the edges of her mind. Lawrence Preston's intrusion and Mrs. Bedford's letter had unsettled her more than she wanted to admit, reminding her of the world beyond Double Creek's boundaries, a world that had been consistently unkind to people like her and Jackson, marked by visible differences that society judged as deficiencies. Could they truly build something lasting in the face of such external pressures? Or was their connection merely the product of isolation, destined to wither when confronted with the harsher realities beyond their winter sanctuary? As if sensing her thoughts, Jackson reached across the space between them, taking her hand in his. "Merry Christmas, Victoria," he said simply, his touch anchoring her to the present moment, to the warmth they'd found together despite all odds. "Merry Christmas, Jackson," she wrote on her slate, choosing to set aside her doubts, at least for tonight. January brought bitter cold that transformed the Wyoming landscape into a realm of blinding white and crystalline blue. Days shortened to brief interludes of pale sunlight between long fire-lit evenings, where the Double Creek household gathered close for warmth and companionship. Victoria found herself cherishing these winter-bound weeks despite their isolation, or perhaps because of it. Within the ranch's sheltered confines, she had discovered acceptance she'd never found in Philadelphia's crowded streets. The new year also brought subtle shifts in her relationship with Jackson. Nothing was spoken outright, but small changes accumulated like snowflakes, his hand lingering when he passed her the account books, her veil remaining off during their evening conversations. Shared glances that communicated without slate or speech. Mrs. Hollister observed these developments with knowing eyes, but maintained a discreet silence, though Victoria occasionally caught the older woman hiding satisfied smiles behind her perpetual knitting. As February approached, Jackson's leg had healed enough that Dr. Miller finally declared him fit for limited riding. Welcome news as the ranch prepared for spring calving season. The first day Jackson rode out with Sam to check the nearest pastures, Victoria found herself standing at the study window long after they'd disappeared from view, an unfamiliar anxiety tightening her chest. "He'll be fine," Mrs. Hollister remarked, appearing silently beside her. "That boy learned to ride one-armed years ago. The leg won't slow him down." Victoria nodded, embarrassed at being caught in such obvious concern. She reached for her slate. "We need him healthy for spring work." Mrs. Hollister's knowing look cut through the practical justification. "Indeed we do," she agreed mildly. "The ranch needs him. We all do, in different ways." Before Victoria could respond, Ellis burst through the front door, stamping snow from his boots. "Riders coming! 3 men from town!" Victoria moved to the window again, spotting 3 figures approaching through the snow-covered yard. One she recognized immediately as Frank Dawson, the man who delivered news of Garrett Williams's death months ago. The others were strangers, one elderly with a distinguished bearing, the other younger, expensively dressed despite the harsh weather. Mrs. Hollister frowned. "That's Judge Parker with Frank Dawson. Don't recognize the third man." Ellis, hovering in the doorway, supplied the answer. "Heard in town last month that Williams's nephew arrived from back east. Come to claim the property, they said." Something cold settled in Victoria's stomach at these words. Mrs. Hollister must have sensed her unease, because she patted Victoria's arm reassuringly before moving toward the door. "I'll put coffee on. You'd best greet them since Jackson's out." Straightening her shoulders and checking that her veil was properly arranged, Victoria opened the front door as the men reached the porch. Frank Dawson recognized her immediately, his expression registering surprise. "Miss Mercer, you're still in the territory?" His tone suggested he'd assumed she'd long since returned east. Victoria nodded, gesturing to the men inside out of the cold. Once they'd removed snow-covered coats and hats, she led them to the main room, where a fire burned welcoming in the hearth. On her slate she wrote, "Welcome to Double Creek Ranch. Mr. Harmon is checking cattle but should return shortly. Judge." Parker, a dignified man in his 70s with white hair and keen eyes, studied her slate with interest. "You must be the young lady who came to marry Garrett Williams. Frank mentioned your distinctive situation." Victoria nodded, her guard rising at his diplomatic phrasing. "This is Edward Williams," the judge continued, indicating the well-dressed younger man. "Garrett's nephew and heir." Edward Williams was perhaps 35, with fashionable side whiskers and the soft hands of someone unaccustomed to physical labor. His gaze moved from Victoria's veiled face to her slate and back, poorly disguised curiosity in his expression. "I understand you. Found employment here after my uncle's unfortunate passing," he said. "Most resourceful of you." Something in his condescending tone reminded Victoria uncomfortably of Lawrence Preston. She wrote simply, "Mr. Harmon offered me a position when I had nowhere to go." Mrs. Hollister arrived with coffee, providing a welcome interruption. As she served the visitors, Judge Parker explained their presence. "We've come regarding some legal matters involving the Williams property," he said. "Documents were discovered among Garrett's papers that require clarification. We hope Mr. Harmon might assist. As I understand, he was acquainted with Garrett." Victoria wrote, "They were neighbors, not close friends." "What documents?" Edward Williams set down his coffee cup, leaning forward. "Letters between my uncle and your employer regarding water rights to Elk Creek, which runs between their properties. It appears they may have had a verbal agreement about sharing access for cattle." The door opened before Victoria could respond, bringing a blast of cold air and the welcome sight of Jackson and Sam returning from their ride. Jackson paused momentarily at finding visitors in his home, then stepped forward with the natural authority that always seemed to center him in any gathering. "Judge Parker, Mr. Dawson," he greeted them, removing his gloves. "This is unexpected." Introductions were made, and the purpose of the visit explained again. Jackson listened attentively, his expression neutral. "I remember the conversations with Garrett," he confirmed once Judge Parker finished. "We discussed sharing water access during dry summers, but never formalized an agreement in writing. That presents a difficulty," Edward Williams interjected. "I'm preparing to sell the property, and unclear water rights could significantly affect the value." This news visibly surprised Jackson. "Selling? The Williams Ranch has been in your family for 3 generations. Edward made a dismissive gesture. "I have no interest in ranching. My business is in Cincinnati. I merely need to resolve these legal matters before listing the property." Victoria watched Jackson absorb this information, noting the subtle tightening of his jaw, the only outward sign of his concern. The Williams Ranch bordered Double Creek's eastern pastures. Its new ownership could significantly impact their operations. "Who's the prospective buyer?" Jackson asked. Edward shrugged. "No specific buyer yet, though Mr. Preston from the Diamond P expressed interest when we met in Riverstone last week." Victoria and Jackson exchanged a quick glance, both recognizing the implications. If Preston acquired the Williams property, he would control even more of the region's water access and grazing land. "I see," Jackson said carefully. "Well, regarding the water rights, I believe Garrett and I both understood that Elk Creek would remain accessible to both properties, regardless of ownership. That was the spirit of our discussion, if not the legal letter." Judge Parker nodded thoughtfully. "Without written documentation, it becomes your word against competing interests. Perhaps we could draw up a formal agreement now, before any sale." The conversation continued for another hour, delving into legal details about property lines, creek access points, and grazing rights. Throughout the discussion, Victoria noticed Edward Williams studying her whenever he thought she wasn't looking. His expression a mixture of curiosity and calculation that made her increasingly uncomfortable. When the men finally prepared to leave, Edward deliberately lingered behind as the others collected their coats. Approaching Victoria directly, he spoke in a lowered voice. "I understand you were to be my uncle's bride," he said, his gaze moving from her veiled face to her slate. "A curious arrangement given your circumstances." Victoria stiffened but wrote with steady hands. "Mr. Williams sought a wife of honest character. My limitations were disclosed in advance." "Indeed," Edward murmured. "Most commendable." He glanced around the main room, taking in the comfortable furnishings, the bookshelves, the modest but dignified appointments. "You seem to have landed on your feet, though in a rather limited position." Victoria felt heat rise in her cheeks at his insinuation. Before she could respond, Jackson appeared beside her, his presence solid and reassuring. "Miss Mercer is invaluable to Double Creek," he said, his tone pleasant but firm. "We consider ourselves fortunate that circumstances brought her to us." Edward's gaze shifted between them, a knowing smile touching his lips. "I see. Most fortunate indeed." He donned his hat with a slight bow. "Perhaps we'll speak again before I complete the sale. Good day to you both." As the riders disappeared down the snow-covered drive, Victoria turned to Jackson, her slate filled with urgent questions. "Preston buying the Williams Ranch? What would that mean for Double Creek?" Jackson's expression was grim. "Nothing good. Lawrence has wanted to expand in this direction for years. With both properties, he'd control most of the water access in the Eastern Valley." He removed his coat slowly, his movements betraying fatigue from the morning's ride. "We should discuss this further, but first I need to speak with Sam about adjusting the calving pasture arrangements." That evening, after the ranch hands had retired to the bunkhouse and Mrs. Hollister to her room, Jackson and Victoria sat before the fire, maps of the adjoining properties spread between them. For over an hour they discussed options, contingencies, and potential impacts of Preston acquiring the Williams Ranch. "Could you purchase it instead?" Victoria wrote, the coloured chalk from his Christmas gift, allowing her to underline the question, for emphasis. Jackson sighed, rubbing his temple. "Not without significant debt. We're stable but not flush with cash, especially with spring expenses coming." Victoria wrote thoughtfully, "Edward Williams seems primarily interested in a quick, profitable sale." "That's my impression too," Jackson agreed, studying the map again. "He has no attachment to the land itself." Victoria hesitated, then wrote, "What if you offered a partial purchase? Just the creek lands and access rights?" Jackson looked up, considering. "A smaller parcel might be within our means. Preston wants the whole property, but Williams might be persuaded if the price is right." He nodded slowly. "It's worth exploring. I'll write to Williams tomorrow proposing terms." As they gathered the maps, Jackson's hand brushed Victoria's, the brief contact sending warmth through her despite the gravity of their discussion. He paused, looking directly at her. "I'm sorry this is happening," he said quietly. "Just when things were becoming—" He trailed off, but Victoria understood. Just when their relationship was deepening, just when possibilities were opening between them, external forces had intruded, reminding them both that their sanctuary at Double Creek existed within a larger world that operated by different rules. She wrote carefully, "We'll find a solution." Jackson smiled, the worry in his eyes lightening slightly. "We will. Together." 2 weeks later, a heavy snowstorm isolated Double Creek completely, the drifts piling higher than the corral fences, making even trips to the barn challenging. Of the key, households settled into the enforced confinement, finding comfort in familiar routines and shared work. Victoria used the time to organize spring planting schedules for the kitchen garden, while Jackson drafted letters regarding the Williams property and updated breeding records. On the third day of the storm, as afternoon light faded to early evening, Mrs. Hollister announced she was retiring early with a headache, a rare occurrence that left Victoria and Jackson alone in the main room, hours before their usual evening conversations. "Would you read aloud?" Jackson asked, gesturing toward the bookshelves. "Perhaps some Emerson? The words might distract from this endless howling wind." Victoria nodded, selecting a volume and settling beside him on the sofa, rather than in her usual separate chair. As the minutes stretched to hours, their positions gradually relaxed. Jackson's arm along the back of the sofa, Victoria's slate occasionally set aside, as they communicated through gestures and expressions that had become their own private language. The intimacy of the moment, firelight, poetry, isolation from the world outside, created a bubble of warmth that pushed away thoughts of Preston, Edward Williams, and their threatened sanctuary. When Victoria finally set the book aside, the mantel clock showed it was nearly midnight. "We should rest," Jackson said reluctantly. "But I've enjoyed this evening immensely." Victoria nodded, reaching for her slate to express the same sentiment. As she wrote, a sudden violent gust rattled the windows, and a sharp crack from above made them both look up in alarm. The north chimney, Jackson realized, rising quickly. That sounded like masonry failing. Victoria followed him upstairs, where they discovered snow blowing into the unused guest room through a gap where the chimney joined the roof. Jackson immediately began moving furniture away from the damage, instructing Victoria to fetch extra sheets to temporarily block the opening. Working together in the freezing room, they managed to create a makeshift barrier against the blowing snow. Jackson examined their handiwork critically. "It will hold until morning, but we'll need to check it regularly through the night. The temperature's dropping. If that snow melts and refreezes, it could cause structural damage." Victoria nodded, understanding, her breath visible in the cold air. In the dim lamplight, with snow swirling around them and wind shrieking outside, she was suddenly intensely aware of Jackson's presence, his capability despite his missing arm, his calm problem-solving in crisis, his unwavering care for his home and everyone in it. Something must have shown in her expression, because Jackson's focus shifted from the damaged roof to her face. For a long moment, they stood in perfect stillness, the howling storm outside contrasting with the absolute quiet between them. Then, Jackson slowly raised his hand to her face, his fingers gently brushing against her veil, in silent question. Victoria hesitated only briefly before nodding permission, holding perfectly still as he carefully lifted the veil away. Unlike their Christmas Eve moment by the fire, when she had revealed her scars to him, this felt different, more intimate, more significant. Jackson studied her face with such tenderness that Victoria felt tears gathering in her eyes. "You are so beautiful," he said softly, his fingers tracing the line where scarred tissue met smooth skin. "All of you. Exactly as you are." Victoria closed her eyes, overwhelmed by emotions too complex for her slate to capture. When she opened them again, Jackson was watching her with such open longing that her heart seemed to stop, then restart with painful clarity. "Victoria," he said, her name like a prayer on his lips. "I've tried to be patient, to give you time, and space to be certain, but tonight—" He drew a deep breath. "Tonight I find I can't remain silent any longer. I love you. Not despite your scars or your silence, but wholly, completely, as the remarkable woman you are." The declaration hung in the frigid air between them, transforming the damaged room into something sacred. Victoria reached for her slate with trembling hands, but Jackson gently stopped her. "You don't need to write your response," he said. "Just tell me, in whatever way feels right to you, if there's any chance you might someday return my feelings." Victoria set the slate aside deliberately. Then, with slow deliberation, she took his hand and placed it over her heart, holding it there so he could feel its rapid beating. With her other hand, she touched his cheek, her fingers tracing his features as his had traced hers. Understanding dawned in Jackson's eyes. "Truly," he whispered. Victoria nodded, a smile transforming her face, scarred side and smooth side united, in genuine joy. Then, gathering courage from the love in his eyes, she leaned forward and pressed her lips to his answer, more eloquent than any written word. The kiss was gentle, tentative at first, then deepening as Jackson's arm encircled her waist, drawing her closer. When they finally parted, both breathless despite the cold, Jackson rested his forehead against hers. "I never thought to find this again," he murmured. "After losing my arm, I believed certain doors were closed to me forever. Marriage, family, the future my parents imagined for me. Then you arrived, and suddenly all things seemed possible again." Victoria reached for her slate, needing to express thoughts too complex for gestures alone. She wrote, "I came west seeking security, thinking damaged goods like me could hope for nothing more than practical arrangement. You offered respect instead of pity, saw strength where others saw only limitation." Jackson read her words, then met her eyes again. "We make each other whole, don't we? Not by replacing what's lost, but by honoring what remains." Victoria nodded, and writing exactly that, another violent gust rattled the damaged roof, breaking the moment and reminding them of the practical situation. Jackson glanced at the makeshift repair, then back at Victoria. "We should return downstairs before we freeze," he said, reluctance evident in his voice. "But Victoria, this conversation isn't finished. Tomorrow, when the storm passes, we have much to discuss about our future." She wrote quickly, "I already know my future belongs at Double Creek, with you." The simple declaration brought such joy to Jackson's face that Victoria felt her heart might burst. He kissed her once more, briefly but with unmistakable promise, before they made their way back downstairs to the warmth of the fire. The following morning brought clear skies and a transformed world, not just the snow-covered landscape outside, but the emotional territory between them. Though they maintained proper decorum in Mrs. Hollister's presence, stolen glances and lingering touches communicated their changed relationship throughout the day's work. By evening, the makeshift roof repair had been properly addressed, the ranch hands had cleared paths to the essential buildings, and the immediate crisis had passed. After dinner, when Mrs. Hollister announced her intention to inventory the pantry preserves, Jackson asked Victoria to join him in the study. Once the door closed behind them, he took both her hands in his. "I spoke with Mrs. Hollister this afternoon," he said, a hint of nervousness beneath his usual confidence. "Asked for her blessing as the closest thing to family either of us has nearby." Victoria raised her eyebrows questioningly. "She said, and I quote, 'About time you stopped mooning around and made an honest declaration,'" Jackson reported with a chuckle. Then his expression grew serious. "She also reminded me that while our hearts may be certain, we should consider the practical realities carefully." Victoria released one hand to reach for her slate. "What realities?" Jackson sighed. "The world beyond Double Creek, Lawrence Preston's ambitions, the Williams property situation, my limitations as a one-armed rancher, your need to communicate through writing." He met her eyes directly. "Life won't always be as secluded and accepting as our household. Are you prepared for that?" Victoria considered his words carefully, appreciating his honesty, even as she recognized the fears underlying his concerns. After a moment, she wrote, "Are you suggesting we shouldn't pursue happiness because others might disapprove? That seems unlike the Jackson Harmon I know." A smile touched his lips. "You're right, it does." He squeezed her hand. "I suppose I needed to hear your certainty once more before I asked the question that's been in my heart since Christmas." Victoria felt her pulse quicken as Jackson lowered himself awkwardly to one knee before her, maintaining his balance with visible effort. "Victoria Mercer," he said, his voice steady despite the vulnerability in his eyes, "I know this isn't the life you journeyed west expecting to find. I'm not the husband you came seeking. But if you could see a future with me, building this ranch together, facing whatever challenges come our way, I would be honored to call you my wife." "What did Preston want?" Jackson asked once they were alone. Victoria hesitated, then wrote truthfully, "To remind me he believes you're a poor choice for a husband." Jackson's jaw tightened. "And to renew his employment offer, I imagine." She nodded, adding, "He thinks I'll regret choosing love over advantage. Will you?" Jackson asked quietly, vulnerability momentarily visible beneath his usual confidence. Victoria's answer was to remove her veil completely, standing unshielded on the porch where anyone riding by might see her scarred face. She wrote 3 words, "Never, not ever," then set down her slate to take his face between her hands, kissing him with a certainty that required no written or spoken language to express. When they separated, Jackson's eyes held renewed determination. "Preston hasn't won yet. I have one more option to explore regarding the Williams property." 3 days later, Jackson rode to Riverstone alone, returning late afternoon with carefully controlled excitement. He found Victoria in the kitchen garden, transplanting seedlings with Mrs. Hollister. "I need to speak with you," he said, helping Victoria to her feet and brushing soil from her hands. "Both of you, actually." In the kitchen, with coffee poured and the door closed against curious ranch hands, Jackson explained his journey's purpose and outcome. "I spoke with Judge Parker and the bank manager," he began. "With the judge's help, I've secured financing to make Williams a counteroffer, not just for the creek parcels, but for the entire property." Mrs. Hollister gasped softly. Jackson Harmon, tell me you haven't mortgaged Double Creek to the hilt? Not entirely, Jackson assured her. The loan is substantial but manageable, especially with the increased cattle prices this year. Between that and my mother's inheritance I've never touched. We can match Preston's offer, Victoria wrote urgently. What did Williams say? He's considering it, Jackson replied. Judge Parker made a compelling legal argument that Preston's purchase might face challenges due to potential monopolistic practices regarding water rights. Williams doesn't want complications delaying his return east. Victoria wrote thoughtfully, it's still a significant risk financially. Yes, Jackson acknowledged, but sometimes you have to risk what you have to protect what matters. His gaze held hers intently. I won't let Preston threaten our future, Victoria. Double Creek is your home now too, our home, and hopefully our children's someday, worth any risk to secure. The mention of children, so casually included in his vision of their future, brought unexpected tears to Victoria's eyes. Despite their engagement, they hadn't discussed family specifically. Her hand rose unconsciously to her scarred throat, uncertainty flashing across her features. Jackson caught the gesture and understood immediately. You're worried about children? That they might inherit your inability to speak? Victoria nodded, slowly writing, or that I couldn't call them if they were in danger. We would adapt, Jackson said simply, as we've adapted to everything else. Our children would know both their parents are whole and capable, exactly as they are. He smiled gently. Besides, Mrs. Hollister has a voice loud enough for all of us. The older woman snorted, but her eyes were suspiciously bright. Someone needs to keep this household in line. She rose briskly, patting Victoria's shoulder as she passed. You two have plans. I'll see you for dinner. After she'd gone, Victoria wrote the question burning in her heart. You truly want children with me? More than anything, Jackson answered without hesitation. A family, a future, all of it. With you, Victoria, only ever with you. The week that followed brought tense waiting as Williams considered competing offers for his uncle's property. Victoria threw herself into wedding preparations, focusing on practical matters to distract from the uncertainty hanging over their future. She sewed her wedding dress, a simple but elegant creation of pale blue silk, high-necked to cover her, scars but beautifully tailored to her slender figure. No veil, Mrs. Hollister asked, as Victoria showed her the completed dress. Victoria shook her head, writing, Jackson loves me as I am. Our wedding guests can see me the same way. Mrs. Hollister nodded approval. Brave decision. Right one, too. The answer to Jackson's counteroffer arrived 3 days before the wedding, delivered by Judge Parker himself, who rode into the yard late afternoon with an expression that revealed nothing. Williams has made his decision, he announced once gathered with Jackson, Victoria, and Mrs. Hollister in the study. Jackson stood tall, his single arm steady at his side. And? Judge Parker allowed himself a small smile. He's accepted your offer, son. The papers are drawn up, ready for signing in my office tomorrow. The relief that flooded the room was palpable. Mrs. Hollister let out a rare whoop of joy. Jackson closed his eyes briefly in silent gratitude, and Victoria felt tears streaming unchecked down her face, both scarred and unscarred sides wet with happiness. There's more, Judge Parker continued. Preston was displeased, to put it mildly, threatened legal action, claimed prior verbal agreement. The judge's smile widened. Williams didn't appreciate the attempted intimidation. He specifically instructed me to inform Preston the sale was final. To you and no other. What changed? His mind, Jackson asked. Partly my legal arguments, partly your financial offer, Judge Parker admitted. But mostly, I believe, it was something Miss Mercer said during your meeting. Victoria looked up in surprise, her eyebrows raised in question. Williams mentioned your comment about verbal agreements made in good faith, the judge explained. Said it got him thinking about his uncle's intentions for the land, he shrugged. Or perhaps he simply preferred dealing with straightforward ranchers over Preston's type. Either way, Double Creek has just doubled its acreage. Congratulations. The wedding day dawned clear and perfect, with spring flowers carpeting the valley and birdsong filling the air. Ranch hands had transformed the front yard into a wedding venue, benches arranged in rows, an arch of twisted willow branches marking where vows would be exchanged, tables set up for the feast to follow. Guests began arriving mid-morning, neighboring ranchers and their families, townspeople from Riverstone, even Dr. Miller, who had treated both Victoria's arrival and Jackson's broken leg. To Victoria's surprise, Edward Williams appeared briefly to offer congratulations before catching the eastbound stage, fulfilling his promise to attend before returning to Cincinnati. Most surprising was Lawrence Preston's arrival, alone, impeccably dressed, his expression unreadable as he presented an expensive silver serving platter as a wedding gift. "No hard feelings about the Williams property," he told Jackson with practiced grace. "Business is business after all." Jackson accepted the gift with equal civility. "Of course, we're honored you could attend." Preston's gaze lingered on Victoria, standing proudly at Jackson's side without her veil, her scars visible to all. Something like genuine admiration flickered in his eyes before he masked it with his usual smooth demeanor. "Congratulations, Mrs. Harmon," he said, using her married name hours before the ceremony. "It seems you found your proper place after all." Victoria accepted the backhanded compliment with a dignified nod, writing briefly on her slate, "The worth of a place depends on who shares it with you." Preston read her words, then surprised them both with what appeared to be a sincerely respectful bow before moving to take his seat among the other guests. The ceremony itself passed in a blur of emotion for Victoria. Judge Parker spoke eloquently about commitment and partnership overcoming life's challenges. Sam stood proudly as Jackson's best man, while Mrs. Hollister, teary despite her attempts at maintaining her usual brisk demeanor, represented Victoria's family. Jackson's vows, spoken clearly for all to hear, acknowledged their unique journey. "Victoria, when you arrived in Wyoming, we were both considered incomplete by the world's narrow standards. Today I pledge to continue seeing you as I always have, not defined by what you've lost, but magnificent in who you are. My partner, my equal, my heart's true match." Victoria's written vows, read aloud by Judge Parker, brought tears to many eyes. "Jackson, I journeyed west, seeking mere existence, and found abundant life instead. You taught me that our supposed brokenness creates unique strength when joined together. I pledge my life, my heart, and my complete self to you, speaking through my hands what my voice cannot, but my soul has always known." When Judge Parker pronounced them husband and wife, Jackson kissed her without hesitation before the assembled witnesses, a public declaration that the scarred woman without voice had found complete acceptance in love. The celebration continued well into evening, with music, dancing, and enough food to satisfy even the hungriest ranch hands. As sunset painted the Wyoming sky in brilliant oranges and purples, Victoria found herself standing slightly apart, watching Jackson laugh with Sam and Ellis near the barn. Mrs. Hollister joined her, following her gaze. "He's been a different man since you came," she observed. "Happier, more complete." Victoria wrote, "As am I. I never imagined finding this when I stepped off that train." Mrs. Hollister nodded sagely. "Life rarely follows the path we expect. Usually it turns out better, if we're brave enough to walk the unexpected one." She patted Victoria's arm. "You two were made for each other. Everyone sees it now." As if sensing their conversation, Jackson looked up, his eyes finding Victoria across the yard. The love in his gaze, visible to anyone watching, required no words or gestures to express its depth. Victoria smiled in return, her scarred face radiant with happiness that transformed her perceived flaws into marks of the extraordinary journey that had brought them together. 5 years later, the Double Creek Ranch had flourished beyond anyone's expectations. The combined original property and Williams land now supported one of the territory's most successful cattle operations, known for innovative breeding practices and fair business dealings. A modest but comfortable foreman's house had been built for Sam and his new wife near the main ranch house, while Ellis, now a capable young man of 23, had been promoted to assistant foreman. On a bright September morning, Victoria sat on the wide front porch, watching Jackson in the yard below. He was demonstrating rope techniques to their 4-year-old son, William, who followed his father's every movement with adoring concentration. Despite having only one arm, Jackson had developed methods to accomplish every ranching task required. Of him, adaptations he now patiently taught his son. Victoria's hands rested on her growing belly, where their second child would arrive before winter. Beside her sat her daughter Margaret, not yet 3, carefully reading a picture book while occasionally looking up to ensure her mother was watching. The little girl's serious expression so resembled her father's that Victoria felt her heart swell with love. "Mama, look!" Margaret exclaimed, pointing to a colourful illustration of a horse. Though Victoria couldn't respond verbally, she had developed countless ways to communicate with her children: facial expressions, hand gestures, written notes, and physical affection that left no doubt of her devotion. Both children had quickly adapted to their mother's unique communication methods, learning to read simple words on her slate remarkably early. More importantly, they showed no confusion or dismay about their parents' physical differences. To them, a father with one arm and a mother who wrote instead of spoke were simply normal, their family perfect exactly as it was. Mrs. Hollister emerged from the house, wiping flour-covered hands on her apron. Though she had threatened retirement at least annually since Victoria and Jackson's wedding, she remained an integral part of their household, unofficial grandmother to the children and steadfast friend to them all. "Rider coming," she announced, shading her eyes against the morning sun. "Looks like Sam's boy." Victoria nodded, recognizing the teenage son of their foreman, approaching rapidly on horseback. The young man dismounted in a flurry of excitement, waving a telegram. "Mr. Harmon, important news from Cheyenne," he called as Jackson approached, William trailing behind. Jackson read the telegram quickly, his expression brightening before he looked up at Victoria on the porch. "The Railroad Commission has approved our spur line proposal," he called. "Construction begins next spring, connecting directly to Double Creek's eastern boundary." Victoria clasped her hands in joy. The culmination of 2 years' careful negotiation and planning finally realized. The railroad connection would transform their shipping capabilities, increasing profits while reducing the physical toll of long cattle drives. As Jackson swept William up in a one-armed hug of celebration, Victoria found herself reflecting on the extraordinary journey that had brought them here. From the devastating fire that scarred her body, but not her spirit, to the battlefield that took Jackson's arm, but not his determination. From her desperate arrival in Wyoming territory as a mail-order bride to becoming the respected mistress of a thriving ranch and mother to beautiful children, Jackson climbed the porch steps, setting William down to run to his sister while he joined Victoria on the bench. His hand covered hers, where it rested on her rounded belly, their child stirring beneath their joined fingers. "Another victory for Double Creek," he said, satisfaction evident in his voice. "Who would have thought when you stepped off that train that we'd build all this together?" Victoria reached for the slate she still carried everywhere, writing the truth that remained constant through all their challenges and triumphs. Two supposedly broken people, creating something whole and beautiful, exactly as we were always meant to. Jackson smiled, leaning forward to kiss her scarred cheek with the same tenderness he'd shown from the beginning, when he'd been the first person to truly see beyond her damaged exterior to the woman within. "Exactly as we were always meant to," he agreed, their children's laughter providing perfect accompaniment to the love that had transformed them both, proving that sometimes life's most painful wounds lead to its greatest blessings. 15 years. After Victoria stepped off the train at Riverstone Station, Double Creek Ranch had become a Wyoming landmark, not just for its size and prosperity, but for the remarkable family at its heart. On a crisp autumn morning, as golden aspen leaves drifted on the breeze, a young journalist from the Cheyenne Tribune arrived at the ranch. Emma Parker, barely 25 and determined to prove herself in the male-dominated newspaper world, had convinced her editor to let her profile the Harmons, whose unusual story and business success had become something of a regional legend. Victoria welcomed the young woman into their home with the gracious confidence that had become her hallmark. At 42, her face still bore the scars from that long-ago fire, but she no longer thought of them as defining features. Years of Wyoming, sun and wind, had added character lines around her eyes and mouth that told stories of laughter and life lived fully. "Thank you for agreeing to this interview, Mrs. Harmon," Emma said, setting up her notebook at the kitchen table. "I've heard so many stories about Double Creek and your family." Victoria smiled and wrote on the slate she still carried, though these days it was a beautifully crafted one inlaid with mother-of-pearl, a 10th anniversary gift from Jackson. "Some of what you've heard might even be true," she wrote, her eyes twinkling. Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of the Harmon children, William, now 14 and nearly as tall as his father, Margaret, 12, with her mother's hazel eyes and quiet determination, and Robert, 10, named for Jackson's father and possessing his grandfather's gift for storytelling. "These are my treasures," Victoria wrote, as the children greeted their mother before politely introducing themselves. To the visitor, Emma noted how they naturally checked their mother's slate for instructions or comments, the communication between them flowing seamlessly despite the absence of verbal exchange. Jackson joined them shortly, his 50 years sitting lightly on his broad shoulders. Silver now threaded his dark hair, and laugh lines framed his eyes. But he moved with the same confident stride Emma had been told about, a man completely at ease with himself and his place in the world. "Miss Parker wants to know our story," Victoria wrote to her husband, who settled beside her at the table. "Which part?" Jackson asked, smiling at the young journalist. "The business side, the railroad expansion, the cattle breeding program?" "All. Fascinating subjects," Emma acknowledged. "But what my readers really want to know is the human story, how a mail-order bride with facial scars who couldn't speak and a one-armed rancher built all this." She gestured toward the window where the sprawling ranch complex was visible. "It's rather extraordinary." "Not to us," Jackson replied simply. "We just lived one day at a time, doing what needed doing." Victoria's chalk moved across her slate. "The extraordinary part was finding someone who saw beyond what was missing to what remained." As the children dispersed to their afternoon chores, William to help with the horses, Margaret to check her beloved garden before the first frost, and Robert to complete his schoolwork, Jackson and Victoria recounted their journey for the young journalist. They spoke of challenges overcome, the bitter winter when blue-tongue disease threatened their herd, the drought year when Lawrence Preston tried again to leverage water rights against them, the fire that destroyed the original barn but spared the animals thanks to quick action by Sam and the ranch hands. They shared triumphs celebrated. The first time their specially bred cattle fetched premium prices in Chicago, watching Sam's son graduate from the Territorial University. The day they paid off the loan for the Williams property 5 years early. But what struck Emma most forcefully was the quiet pride they showed when speaking of their children's accomplishments and character. William has his father's gift with horses, Victoria wrote. Margaret can calculate breeding percentages in her head faster than anyone. And Robert, she smiled at Jackson, who finished her thought. Robert has his mother's ability to see into people's hearts, Jackson said. Makes him a natural peacemaker. Emma noted how they complemented each other's strengths, filling in gaps without conscious effort, a partnership refined through years of shared purpose. Were you ever worried, she asked carefully, about how your children would be affected by your unique circumstances? Victoria and Jackson exchanged a glance that contained volumes of shared understanding before Victoria wrote her answer. We worried they might face unkindness from those who value only conventional wholeness. Instead, they've learned that worth isn't measured by what's physically present or absent. Our children see differences as natural variations, not deficiencies, Jackson added. That perspective serves them well in all relationships. As their conversation continued, Emma observed the household's seamless operation. Mrs. Hollister, now in her 70s but still formidable, directing dinner preparations with the help of a younger assistant. Sam stopping by with cattle reports, his interaction with Jackson reflecting decades of mutual respect. Young ranch hands treating Victoria with genuine deference despite her silent communication. You've created something remarkable here, Emma commented as afternoon shadows lengthened. Not just a successful ranch, but a community that values people for their contributions rather than their conformity. Victoria wrote thoughtfully, perhaps that's our true legacy, beyond the land or livestock. Later, as Emma prepared to leave, Jackson walked her to her waiting buggy. In the yard, he paused, looking back at the house where Victoria stood on the porch, silhouetted in the doorway's golden light. One thing you should understand, he said quietly. What outsiders see as disabilities, my missing arm, Victoria's scars and silence, we've never experienced as losses within our marriage. They're simply aspects of who we are, no more defining than eye color or height. Emma considered this perspective so different from prevailing attitudes. That's a powerful viewpoint, Mr. Harmon. It's the truth, Jackson replied simply. The story worth telling isn't how we overcame our supposed brokenness. It's that we recognized what society calls broken is merely different, and different can be beautiful, complete, and profoundly right. As Emma drove away, she glanced back to see Jackson mounting the porch steps to join Victoria. Even at a distance, the tenderness with which they greeted each other was unmistakable. His hand gently touching her scarred cheek, her fingers straightening his empty sleeve with familiar care. The following Sunday, Emma's article appeared in the Cheyenne Tribune under the headline, The Strength of Broken Places, How Double Creek Ranch Redefined Wholeness. The piece began. In a world that often values conventional perfection, Jackson and Victoria Harmon have spent 15 years demonstrating a profound truth, that when we embrace our supposed brokenness rather than hiding it, we discover unexpected strength, beauty, and connection that might otherwise remain undiscovered. The article found its way to ranches, homesteads, and parlors throughout Wyoming territory. For weeks afterward, letters arrived at Double Creek, some from business associates expressing newfound respect, others from parents of children with various disabilities seeking advice or encouragement. Most meaningful was a letter from a young woman in Denver who wrote, "After reading about Mrs. Harmon, I've decided to stop hiding my own facial scars. If she can build such a remarkable life without shame, perhaps I can find courage to do the same." Victoria placed this letter carefully in the cedar box, where she kept her most precious mementos, alongside the now yellowed advertisement that had brought her west, her children's first written words, and the slate on which she'd accepted Jackson's proposal. That evening, sitting together on their porch watching the sunset paint the Wyoming sky in spectacular colors, Victoria wrote a simple message to her husband of 15 years. Who would have thought our greatest strength would be found in the places the world called broken? Jackson smiled, taking her hand in his. I think we've always known, he replied softly. From that very first day at the train station, when you saw beyond my missing arm and I looked past your silence to the extraordinary woman beneath. As darkness settled over Double Creek Ranch, their legacy continued to spread outward like ripples on still water, touching lives far beyond their boundaries, challenging assumptions about wholeness and worth, demonstrating that sometimes life's deepest wounds create its most beautiful possibilities. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hits the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out, and don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.